Hello, everybody. Nice to be back with you. This is Enjoy English School, and I'm Bruce.
And I'm Laurie.
Today and tomorrow, we have our Spotlight on Taiwan lesson for you. Every month, we choose a place in Taiwan to talk about it very proudly because there's so many interesting and beautiful and worthy places to talk about and visit. We are going to, today and tomorrow, talk about Sanxia's most famous secret, Indigo Dyeing.
所以呢，今天跟明天我们来到了深入台湾的单元，那么要来谈到的文章中文的标题是蓝色狂想曲三峡蓝染所以很明显的各位就知道我们今天跟明天都要来谈到三峡地区的这个蓝染了，那么是非常有趣的一个主题，我们赶快跟着 Bruce 老师一起来看一看。
Okay, let's get started on our first short paragraph here. Indigo dyeing is an ancient art of dyeing and patterning clothes with an especially beautiful blue dye. Now, dye is a word most people don't want to talk about, but this dye is different. This is D-Y-E, and that means to add a color, usually to white materials, such as white cloth, and to change the color.Actually, dyes are in every color you can imagine. But one of the traditional dyes, not only here in Taiwan, but around the world, is indigo dyeing. We have D-Y-E, then we can add I-N-G immediately for the 现在分词. Indigo is the color deep, dark blue.
好，所以呢，我们首先来看到第一句这个讲到了蓝染首先讲到蓝染，那么 indigo 这个字，刚刚呢，这个 Bruce 老师有提到，它其实是一种深蓝色那么呢，这种深蓝色，然后后面再加一个染，所以就是我们称的这个蓝染。那么这个 indigo 的这样子的一个蓝染呢，刚刚 Bruce 老师也提到，不止在台湾的三峡，其实在全世界各地就是用这种这个 indigo 这种蓝色去染的这个都叫做蓝染。那么蓝染呢，它是一门就是呢使用一种特别美丽的蓝色染料去呢给这个衣服染色跟这个加上花样的一门古老的技艺所以这里的 ancient 是古老的意思，那么这里的 art 我们可以翻成技艺技术的技，然后呢艺术的艺那么这里的 dyeing 我们刚刚已经讲过是染色，那么 patterning 的话是指这个 pattern 本身它是图案的意思，但是这里被当成动词，所以就是指加上那个图案，加上那个花样那么 patterning clothes 所以是把衣服呢加上这个花样，加上图案，那么用的是什么呢？一种特别美丽的蓝色染料，这里的 dye 又变成是名词了，不是我们前面 dyeing 的动词所以呢这里要注意一下。
Okay, the word art that you mentioned was G-E, ma? Okay, could we use the English word skill here?
I think so.
S-K-I-L-L is a special ability to do something well. That is a skill. Anything that you do, sports, music, production, making objects and making products and so on, though you need skill to do those things.
所以呢这边可以把 skill 一起把它写下来。
Okay, next sentence. The dye itself comes from the indigo plant, which grows very well in humid mountain climates. So how do you get indigo? Well, indigo, the color, this deep blue, comes from a plant.Of course, the plant is called the indigo plant. Flowers, for example, you may have noticed sometimes if you hold a flower, your hand will change color. And that's a kind of natural dyeing. Well, indigo has a dark blue flower to it, and that can be dried and then made into a dye.And has been used in many, many places around the world, as we mentioned, because it grows very well in humid mountain climates. And boy, do we have mountains in Taiwan. And much of the year is very humid here. Not all year round, but especially up here in the north, we have months and months and months of rain, and that will make for a humid climate.
所以呢，接下来讲到 the dye 就是指呢这种蓝色的染料，而且是刚刚呢 Bruce 老师有用到 dark blue， 就是深蓝的意思或者我们讲这个靛蓝色都是一样的。那么这个染料它本身呢是来自于这个蓝染植物，我们叫 Indigo plant。那么蓝染植物是怎么样一个蓝染植物呢？也就是那个在潮湿的山区气候里头长得非常好的蓝染植物。
When fermented, the plant produces a brilliant blue dye. So as we said, the plant can produce blue dye, but you have to add alcohol to it that will bring out the color blue from the plant. To ferment is for a product to naturally produce alcohol. In fact, that's how our alcohol is made that becomes beer or wine or liquor.Those are all forms of alcohol. They are fermented. Alcohol is the fermented product, and all of the drinks that we make are from plants. So wine is from grapes, beer is from hops, and the many kinds of liquors come from many kinds of plants.
所以呢这边讲到了酒跟这个酒呢它发酵是来自各个不同的植物那么呢也提到了我们这个蓝染的这个植物呢，讲到说当这个发酵的时候呢，这个植物它就会产生出会制造出叫 produces 一种非常鲜艳的蓝色的染料。这里的 brilliant 我们通常拿 brilliant 的话会来形容比如说人很聪明非常的有才华。
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
对，那么但是当你把它用来这个形容颜色的时候，它就是指非常的鲜艳的意思。
Okay. You could possibly say shiny instead of brilliant. Brilliant refers to light, and so we think of shiny objects as being brilliant. S-H-I-N-Y, S-H-I-N-Y.
所以呢这边讲到说其实在 brilliant 它也可以去形容就是光线的部分。当它形容光线的时候，它其实就很接近，这就是闪亮很灿烂这样的一个意思。
Okay, our second paragraph now. This blue dye can be used to color cloth, either before or after it is used to make clothing. Now be careful with this word cloth, C-L-O-T-H.If we add es, the th becomes th, clothes, which is hard to say. So if you just say clothes, like close the door, everybody knows what word you are trying to say. Don't worry about that. Now, cloth we think of as very simple material. That's another word for cloth. Material can be made into clothing. Cloth can be made into clothing.
所以呢接下来我们来看到第二段的第一句，讲到说那么这种蓝色的染料呢，它可以被用在去给布上色，在布呢被做成了这个衣服的之前或者是之后都可以的意思那么所以刚刚呢首先 Bruce 老师有提到大家要小心这个发音的部分这个 th 的发音然后呢这里的话呢我们看到了 can be used to， 我们也稍微的复习一下呢 be used to 这个有两种可能性，一个是呢这个被用来做什么什么，就像这里一样，那么 to 的后面是加原形动词的，这个 be used to something 的时候就变成是你很习惯于某个事情，所以这个时候 to 的后面如果有动词，那就变动词 ing 了那么另外呢有时候你还会遇到的是 used to， 那么 used to 的时候呢过去式那个 use 是动词，那就变成曾经怎么样怎么样，所以这三个可以把它一起写。
Textile makers can use tie-dyeing methods to create beautiful and complex patterns. Textile, this is the world of clothing. We use materials, we make materials for all the things we use, not just clothing. Your towels, your pillowcases, your sheets and blankets, all of that is part of the international textile market.
所以呢，接下来讲到了这个纺织的工人呐，这个 textile 是纺织，那么 makers 当然就是工人了。他们会用一种叫做扎染的这个方式呢methods 是方法方式来呢去呢这个创造出非常美丽以及呢复杂的这个图案。这里的 patterns 就变成是名词了不像第一段的是动词，那么就出现了这个扎染。我们来看看它是什么。
Okay, let's explain tie-dyeing now. It refers to tying, pressing, and binding the cloth to control the way the color goes into it. So this art or skill is called tie-dyeing. Now, tying is like when you tie a tie. Good luck with that. Or you tie shoelaces if your shoes have shoelaces. You tie is to use usually a thin piece of material to bring things together and make them stay close together. Pressing is to push down on something. And binding, that means to tie things together very, very tightly. And according to how you use these three skills, you can control the way the indigo will go into the product.Because they will put the product into and under a lot of the indigo dye, D-Y-E. And if it is folded or bound in a special way, the color will not go there. So when you finish, you will have indigo blue, and you untie or unbind what you bound. And that can produce patterns of, say,white, if the cloth was white when you began. Outside of the tying and the binding and the pressing, you will get the original color of the cloth, very often white. And where the dye touches the cloth, when you put it under the dye, then that, of course, will be blue.
所以接下来讲到说，所谓的扎染呢，它指的就是这里的 refers to 指的就是呢，你去呢这个扎布第一个 tying 压布第二个 pressing 跟呢这个捆布第三个 binding 那么这样子的这个方式呢，去这个控制颜色进到布，也就是上到布的那个方式那么这样子就是我们刚刚提到的扎染。
Master craftspeople can do some truly amazing things with very simple tools. Craftsmen or craftspeople are people who have this skill. They know how to do this thing, which is to tie dye. And they don't need big machines and computers and whatnot. They need only simple tools.
所以接下来讲到这个 master craftspeople 就是技艺很精湛的这些工匠们因为 craft 本来是指手工艺或工艺，那么这里加了一个 people， 那就我们可以把它翻成工匠那么技艺很精湛的工匠呢，他们呢可以用非常简单的工具就来做呢一些真的非常令人惊艳的这个图案。
For example,Most beginners are taught to use nothing more than rubber bands, chopsticks, and maybe some marbles. These are the simple tools that we just talked about, especially for beginners. They need only rubber bands to bind the material, the cloth. Chopsticks, I'm not quite sure how those will be used here because I don't know how to tie-dye. And maybe some marbles.Those are round glass objects that children use to play a game with. Again, I don't know how they're used, but I would like to see this done. I'm going to Sanxia to see it.
Right. 好，所以接下来这一句讲到说，那么举个例子来讲，大部分的初学者都被教导去使用呢，仅仅是这个橡皮筋，然后呢筷子，跟也许呢一些弹珠这样子来当他们的工具，就是呼应前一句讲的简单的工具，但是创造出真的很令人惊艳的图案。
So let's think about that as we take a break. Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to finish up today's lesson. Remember, it continues tomorrow. Indigo dyeing is well known as a traditional cloth manufacturing technique in Japan, but Taiwan has its own homegrown indigo industry. As I mentioned earlier, around the world, it is not unusual to find indigo dyeing as part of traditional culture, traditional skills. In Japan, it's rather famous. It's one of their traditional cloth manufacturing or producing techniques. Taiwan, too, has its own. It did not come from Japan. Taiwan originally had its own homegrown, means local, indigo industry.
所以呢，接下来我们来看到最后一段，他讲到说呢，这个蓝染啊，它在日本啊是以一个这个传统的织布的技术而闻名的。那这里我们看到的 is well known as 这里的 be known as， 那就顺便呢都复习一下 be known to 跟 be known for 啊。那么另外呢 manufacturing 这里的 manufacture 它这个是动词，那么指的就是生产制造的意思，所以呢是传统的织布技术来讲呢，蓝染在日本是很有名的。那么但是呢，台湾啊也有它自己本土的这里的 homegrown 哦，就是呢本土的这个蓝染产业。
Taiwan's indigo dyeing industry bloomed in the 1800s when the rich blue dye was considered very fashionable. So Taiwan's local indigo dyeing industry bloomed. This is the opening of a flower, and it represents a time of growth, a time of plenty, a time of abundance, and so on. So it was a good time for the dyeing industry. That's when the rich blue dye was considered very fashionable. Oh, you just had to have some piece of clothing that had this indigo dye in it, or you weren't with it.
好，所以呢，接下来讲到说呢，这个台湾的蓝染产业呢，是在这个19世纪的时候 bloomed 这个动词呢，它原本是指这个花盛开的感觉哦，那个盛开的意思。那么呢，这里除了当盛行来讲，你也可以说那个时期它非常的这个繁荣哦，这样子的感觉。当时呢，这个非常鲜艳的，我们看到 rich 这里不是富有啊，这里呢指的是鲜艳的蓝色染料啊，被认为在当时是被认为相当的时髦、相当的流行的。
Right. Rich blue dye. I forgot to mention this. In the first paragraph, we had the brilliant blue dye, and that would be another way to say the same idea. If you talk about a rich color, you know, it's super yellow or brilliant red, very clearly a particular color. Let's finish up with our last sentence. However, the local cloth dyeing business began to decline around the turn of the 20th century, when the textile industry began to modernize. Now, we have to remember that this skill of indigo dyeing originally was an ancient art, and the modern period of production depends on where you lived. In Europe, it was the late 18th century. Then in the next century, the rest of Europe and North America started to develop, as did Japan. So that's why traditional skills, traditional art forms began to decline around the turn of the 20th century, when Europe, Japan, North America were developing into factories. They had electricity. This is the modern period of production, and many, many, many folk arts began to decline as the textile industry itself began to modernize, began to use electrical machines to produce or to dye products.
所以呢，这个讲到说，然而这个本土的我们这个 local 本土的这个呢染布的这个产业染布业呢，他们呢大约就是在20世纪初的这个时候 ，the turn of the 20th century 20世纪初的时候呢，开始 decline， 就是呢开始衰退了，而也就在这个同时呢，纺织业开始现代化。
Okay, now let's begin our review. In the first paragraph, we have the adjective humid, humid mountain climates. Humid refers to a feeling of water or moisture in the air. It's nothing we touch. It's a feeling. If it's very humid, maybe it's going to rain soon, that kind of feeling. But we have some other adjectives like soaked, wet, and damp. Uh-oh. These all have to do with touching something and feeling how much water is there. If it has so much water that the water is coming out of it, we can call it soaked. If you're out in the rain and your umbrella doesn't work, you're going to be soaked. Wet means there is water in it to some degree, but it's not as much as soaked, but it's more than damp, because damp is the feeling of, I think this was wet not long ago, but it's not yet dry. It's still damp.
所以这里的话 Bruce 老师帮我们补充了很棒的，就是除了我们课文中用到的 humid 这个潮湿指的是看不到的，但是呢你会感觉到有这种湿湿的感觉的这个部分之外呢，我们讲了3个字就是分别是要照着程度从多到少，那个水的多到少，最多的是 soaked。它呢就是像你几乎是淋完雨一样，你全身那个连水跑出来都看得到，这样子那么湿透了然后中间程度的是 wet 那么这个的话呢就可能有液体，你看到它湿了，但是没有像 soaked 那么夸张。那最后的呢程度最小的 damp， 它呢介于湿跟 dry 就是干的中间可能本来有湿过，但是现在快要干但还没，那样子的湿度呢就是 damp。 所以这4个是 Bruce 老师教我们的我们可以把它放在一起来记。
Okay. Hope you learned something and enjoyed while you were learning. Join us the next time. Till then,